Corvallis has always had many of the characteristics of a small town, and yet it has a sophistication that I suppose comes from being associated with a large university.
Corvallis is an average town that has grown from a small village that I knew it in 1900 and is still growing and changing. It will never be the same again.
Corvallis originally was named Marysville, but in it the Marysville conflicted with Marysville, California. It was changed to Corvallis, meaning the heart of the valley.
I knew Punderson Averys. Of course, the early ones were before my time.
I'm Punderson Avery, the great-grandson of J.C. Avery, the first settler in Corvallis. Mr. Avery was a surveyor in Illinois and came to Corvallis in the 1840s. After being out here a year or a little over, then he went back and met his family in covered wagon days. Of course, they took out a land claim, he and his wife, on what's now the southern, I guess you'd say the south part of Corvallis, the Avery Park area, and the old home was in about the city park on South 4th Street there, where the big walnut trees are that's divided there by the highway now. My great-grandfather, J.C. Avery, built the which is now the present Robinette Hardware as a general merchandise store. And it was the first brick building in Corvallis. I'm working at that store presently. I know Van Smith. He is one of the Smith families who have been around South Benton for a good many years.
I'm Van Smith of a pioneer family. It was an early day here in this Corvallis area. And this is my wife, Florence. We've always been a farming family. This is the 4th generation of the Smith farmers here in this area. We don't feel that it's a very hard life because we enjoy this type of living. My grandfather, T.W.B. Smith, bought cattle for Swift and Company out of Portland. He would start out with his saddlebags full of gold, $20 gold pieces, and buy stock. My grandfather, T.W.B. Smith, purchased property close to the little town of Peoria, and they have expanded on that now. The Smiths and the Smith descendants own about 2,000 acres of that ground. This area was farmed with all horse-drawn machinery. Even in my younger days, I started farming with horses. In the 1860s, my grandfather Smith had the old steam thrasher, the hand feed on the front and the straw buck on the back. And the old straw rails would have a horse on each end, and 2 kids would ride these horses. The Willamette Grange was started here in Corvallis, and we celebrated our centennial last year. My grandfather, T.W.B. Smith, was a charter member of that organization, and there has been Smiths on the rolls ever since. At the present time, I am the master of the Willamette Grange. One of the things that brought fame to this country was the start of nudism, when the religious cult set up their little church down on Kiger Island. An old fellow by the name of Sheffield was a preacher, and all of his following came down there, and they would have holy roller meetings, and they would roll on the floor, carry on to great extent. And they finally got the gun and rounded out clothes. And whenever the men would see him coming, they'd get the shotguns meet him at the door, but he had a way with the women. He was later tarred and feathered in Corvallis and ran out of town with a black snake whip. He was later shot in Washington. Somebody killed him. In an early day here in the Willamette Valley, all the families knew each other. In fact, they were pretty near all related to one another. Smiths, the Averys, Whitbys, the Buchanans, the Curriers. And when I was a very small boy, I remember going to Bessie Murphy's family home and driving a team with a load of hogs in it that Father had bought from Bessie's father.
I'm Bessie Gregg Murphy, and I was born in Clatsop County, Oregon in 1894. My father, Stephen A. Gregg, came with his family from Kansas to Oregon in 1874. He was a farmer on a farm which now contains the new high school on Highland Way. And it's also the site of an old Indian camp. He used to dig up, when he was plowing, used to dig up broken Indian bowls. My father's house that he built about 1912 is still standing on the Lloyd Anderson farm. My maternal grandfather was William Crease. Grandfather Crease built his first house in Benton County on his farm in 1878. And the house is still standing on East Grant Street. The Crease building on, I guess it's third, yes, is on the site of my grandfather's home, to which he retired after being a farmer many years. The high school I went to was located where the Central Park is now, right across from the police station. And I graduated in 1914. Corvallis in 1900, and for a while afterwards, was a very small town. And 2nd Street was the main street. There were no business establishments on other streets that I can remember of for a few years. And of course, no paving. And in summer, the dust was inches deep, and in winter, the mud was inches deep. 2nd Street was it. Well, I really started this museum with the things that I was brought up with and had when I was a child. And it's been added to through the years by relatives and friends who didn't know what to do with their old relics. They saw that I had a place to keep it safely, and they were happy to give it to me. And I think more people everybody ought to keep some trace of their family. Not forget them completely, like as if they don't appreciate what their ancestors did for them. See, here are the tools, but these are called crocheting, knitting, and tatting. Now, these are all crocheted. This is the tatting. It's made of little knots. And this is the knitted lace, and it went mostly on pillow slips and petticoats. When this was in style, it was the thing. But people change their ideas, and they're not doing this now. They're doing something else. I'm doing this carding, which straightens out the fibers of the wool, make it spin easier and better. And an extra bonus is getting the cheap lanolin on my hands to make my skin soft. It comes from the sheep's skin to keep its wool soft. I'll wash it after I get it spun. And after I spin it, I can use that yarn for knitting, gloves, and mittens and socks, or weaving rugs and other things. One generation passed things like that on to the next generation more than they do now. You see, this generation is so very different from like mine or my grandmother's. They haven't passed on things. They haven't accepted what we passed on. My father had a 45-70 rifle, which he called Old Meat in the Pot, because he always got what he shot at.
I'm Byron Higby from Peoria, Oregon. My family came to Oregon in the early 1860s, and I collect pioneer firearms. This is a buzz-loading, heavy-barreled cap-lock rifle of the 1840 period, and is the type that was carried to Oregon on wagon trains and used by the early settlers in this country. The flintlock rifles was used from approximately 1500 to 1830. When I speak of the pioneer, the flintlock period, we're talking about the early settlers that came to this country, the immigrants from Europe. The rifle was a necessary tool. I mean, you couldn't hope to survive in this country without it because it furnished everything that you needed in the early days. Now, we speak of accuracy of these with these early rifles. They were as accurate as any guns we have today. Daniel Boone, of course, was who everybody thinks of, and that was his gun, was a flintlock. Wars were fought with them, game was killed with them, and they were just, it was the only method of detonating or shooting a gun.
I'm Morris Bullard, 68 years old. I'm descended from the Oregon pioneers. We were people of the woods. My father and grandfather were loggers, and I was raised in that tradition. Falling and bucking and cold decking came just as natural as eating. My father took great pride in being what he called one of the fine axemen of the community, and he trained me from the time I was a relatively small child to do the same kind of things. He would tell about the skid roads, and one of his first jobs was to walk along with a bucket and a paddle, and on the skid road he would dab skid grease so that the logs would drag easier by these oxen. Later came the steam engines. This was a different kind of logging entirely, and these I remember firsthand. I remember my father telling about the wagon train that came from Illinois to Oregon, in which they brought a sawmill with them. When the wagon train arrived, the leader of the train immediately set up his sawmill, and within days was sawing boards, and within 2 months they had the boards built into a house, and the different families then moved into their own houses. I suppose this was typical of pioneer days. You really respected not only the woods, but the wild game, and while you didn't have hunting laws, you never wasted meat. You didn't waste even the woods. At one time in my logging experience, all the logging was done with horses. Horses were faster than oxen. The horses worked better when they were shod. The steel shoes had cleats in front and sort of spurs in the back that dug into the ground that helped them to get footing for the hard pulls in pulling the logs. You had a cross-section of people who worked in the woods. So many times they were Swedish or Norwegian because they had been loggers in Norway and Sweden, had come to Minnesota and logged off that area and had come down into Oregon. These people are tough and rough and ready, and they don't stop for anything. It's because there's kind of a dash and a go and a daring and the like. You really minded your own business pretty well because, you know, if you got too nosy and the like, I think their reputation for toughness came. They told you off. They put you in your place. Many of them would go on a glorious drunk when they got into town. Pool hall would be their headquarters. Life was kind of, in a way, kind of simple. In the old days, we used to have remedies for everything. but not the kind like we have now. Watkins liniment was good for a cold, guaranteed to cure man or beast. And of course a logger would upend his kerosene bottle, which he used on his saw, and take a good swig to cure a cold. Almost nothing that we use now was available then. You might take a spoon of turpentine. Certainly you rubbed it all over your chest with a little bear fat, or sometimes skunk oil. Among the loggers, they had their oil bottle with a hook on it, which was kerosene with a little bit of cylinder oil mixed with it, which they'd squirt on their saw to cut the pitch. And so some of them would up and squirt a few squirts of that in their mouth and gargle it and swallow it, and that was to cure a cold. And the remedies, I'm sure, did more harm than they ever did good. I know Minerva Kiger Reynolds. She's a very nice old lady, but she'll never let you take a picture of her.
I am Mrs. J. Reynolds, originally Minerva Kiger, and I'm 83 years old. My father was Reuben Kiger, R.C. Kiger, and he came to Corvallis in about 1851 or 2. And he ran 3 farms, but we lived in town. Well, he was born in Knoxville, Illinois, and when he was 12 years old, he worked his way across the plains on a wagon train. Bought Kiger Island, and he cleared that off, and he put out 3,000 peach trees. When he was a child, they raised tomatoes, but they were afraid to eat them. They thought they were poisonous, and they just used them for decoration. Somebody probably tried to commit suicide, and it didn't work. But we ferried across it. And later, when my brother inherited it, he got the county road put in there, and then a bridge, and that's the way it is today. It was the first automobile to pass through Corvallis, and the youngsters running along the walk, and the grown-ups too, they saw that I was puzzled, and they said, "It's an automobile, it's an automobile." Well, I'd heard of automobiles, so I joined the parade, and they had only gone a little ways when they dropped into a mud hole and got stuck, killed the engine. Well, they couldn't start it. They were just stranded there in the mud hole, and there were men enough following it to run out. They just took hold of the wheels of that automobile and set it over on dry land. The ferry was built in 1850, I believe it was, and it ran until 1913, and that's when the bridge was built, the Van Buren Street Bridge. The courthouse, I think, was built in 1888. James Dixon, he owned that land, and he donated a block to the city for a courthouse. I remember the courthouse. In fact, when I graduated from public school, they took us down to the courtroom to take the final examination. Almost frightened us to death. They had 3 saloons there, and quite a bit of drinking, but really, there'd be a fist fight once in a while, or occasionally a little shooting, but nothing to amount to anything. The Opera House was built in 1872, and at that time it was the only public meeting place they had, and the stock companies would come and put on plays there every few weeks. And Mother didn't care very much for them, but Dad and I liked them. We never missed one. And it was raised when Safeway's built their first store in Corvallis. It was used for a parking lot. Well, the Chinese were at a loss after the railroad finished for work. And there were a number of them that opened a laundry at the corner of, it was the southeast corner of 2nd and Jefferson. We called it Chinatown. It was a common sight to see a Chinaman come trotting in, balancing a pole on his shoulder and a bag of laundry on each end of it. OSU was then Oregon Agricultural College, OAC. I graduated from OAC in 1912, and it was the old administration building in the middle, which is still there, and the science hall to the south, and a mechanical hall to the north. The Walter Hall had been built, right in about that time. like the old days best. I knew everybody in those days. There wasn't so many. You knew everybody. And they were friendly. We didn't have any entertainment like they have now. It was just kind of among ourselves. And I liked it. At the same time, I think people were friendly and enjoyed life more than they do now.
I like the old days best. There was a peaceful quality about the town. You knew everybody. The activities were common to all of us. The first 10 years that I lived here, we didn't have a lock on our door and would be gone for weeks at a time. Nobody ever took anything.
When you think about the old times that we used to have here, I think people were much more friendly. That if you went down the road and evening came, there was a chance for something to eat and a place to stay. While now, nobody would take you in and feed you.